Hi, good morning. This is David Rizzo with Rogers Gardens, and I've been a horticulturist at Rogers Gardens for over 20 years, and today I'm going to talk about my side business, and it's called Rizzo's Tomatoes. And Rizzo's Tomatoes, I grow heirloom tomatoes, I grow peppers, and I grow a few other things. And with some of the tomatoes I grow, I start them in 72 count plug trays, and I use a good seed mix. And then as they get established, I'll start moving them up to 4-inch containers. So I'll start shifting them. And so this year is a really good year. So I have about 30 varieties and I have about 15 dwarfs. And so I have katydid, I'm growing chocolate lightning and Fred's tie-dye purple. And these dwarfs are really interesting because a lot of them are crossed with heirlooms. So there's a big interest in the dwarfs right now. So I am growing some really cool varieties, and I'm even growing Melanie's Ballet, which is a tomato of the year. I have those going. And then some of my other heirlooms that I really like, I love Black Crim, I love Pink Berkeley Tie-Dye, I love some of the Pink Brandy Wine, the Sodu strain. I love the Sodu strain, that's my favorite. And Dr. Weishi's Yellow, a lot of cherries too, like Napa Chardonnay. I have chocolate cherry, sun gold I'm gonna be growing, and I'm growing a lot of sauce tomatoes too, so I'm having just regular San Marzanos, but one of my favorite heirlooms that I am growing that's a sauce tomato, that's a paste heirloom, is called Italian Heirloom, so watch for that one. That's a really good one. And then I have other ones too that are really quirky, like Gargamel and Chestnut Chocolate, and some of the little Blue Golds and some of those really different varieties, but I do mix it up. I'll do cherries, I'll do early, I'll do mid, I'll do late, and that way you have more of a cross section of varieties. I brought some of my tomatoes to show you. So the first one is a really good one called katydid, and these are in the trays, so nice little dwarfs. Look how stocky they are, so I really do like these. So when I'm planting them though too, I usually do one seed per cell, and this is a really good dwarf. And another one that I brought today, I brought Cherokee Purple. And the Cherokee Purples are one of my other favorite heirlooms. It's a big slicing tomato, and the flavor is so good on them, so I always do Cherokee Purple. It's a little later, but one of my other favorites. And one of the reasons why Cherokee Purple is one of my favorites is it's really sweet, it's a good slicer, but it's the flavor. When you get into the purple black heirlooms, they have so much flavor. It's more of a complex flavor. This is another variety that I'm growing this year that I really like, and it's a little cherry tomato called Chocolate Sprinkles. So I love this tomato. They're little purple black tomatoes. It's so prolific and the flavor is so sweet, and it has a little bit more of a tartness to it that I like. And one of the things when I'm growing my tomatoes, one of the things that I always stress, because I grow all these from start, from seed to plant to finished plants, and so one of the biggest things I do stress when I'm growing is I like to use an organic seed starting mix. So these little dwarf tomatoes that are in the 72 trays, I'll go through and I'll fill this tray with an organic seed mix. Like the Malibu is a good seed mix because it drains and it really helps the nutrients and just germination. And when I'm transplanting them from these little 72 trays to a 4-inch container, I'm always using a really good organic potting soil. And so I want something that drains really good, and I always make sure that I have them out in full sun. So that way I'm finishing them off so then I can sell them to Rogers Gardens. And here are some tips to look at when you're growing heirloom tomatoes. So one thing I always will do is wherever you're planting them, either in containers or the ground, make sure they get full sun, which is 6 to 8 hours, because tomatoes thrive off of full sun to flower to ripen off the fruit. So that's very important. If you're near the coastal areas, you do want to find a nice warm wall, and sometimes out of the windy areas too. If you're farther inland, you want to protect them a little bit, but definitely always full sun is very crucial for growing tomatoes. And then another thing that I will stress is the soils. So a little different. So when I'm growing them in a container, I want to make sure that I'm using a really good organic potting soil that drains. I don't want something too heavy. I want it sort of in the middle. So, and when I do them in a container, I want about a 17 to 18 inch pot that's wide and about 17 to 18 inches deep. Now, when you're planting your tomatoes in the ground, you want to make sure that, again, full sun, but you always want to break it up and see if you can dig out an area that's at least 6 to 10 inches deep and incorporate a good compost in there. So I'll use worm castings, I'll use Malibu compost, I'll use some of the chicken manure compost, but I want to break that soil so the plants have a chance to root down. That's very crucial. If the soil is too compacted, they won't grow. So that's very crucial with planting them in the ground. And another thing too with fertilizing, because tomatoes are heavy feeders, so I will fertilize when I plant. I'm using a really good organic fertilizer that's high in phosphorus. So I have one of the tomato fertilizers, the all-purpose by Down to Earth. That's a good one. The Bios Alive is a good one. I always will add extra calcium, especially with the sauce tomatoes. Okay, when growing your tomatoes, there's two varieties of tomatoes. There's determinate, which are bush varieties, and indeterminate, which are vine types. So the determinate varieties will get, 2 to 3, 4 feet tall, and you really don't need to cage those. You can just use a sturdy stake with them, like San Marizanos, and there's a lot of the dwarfs that will get 2 to 4 feet tall, so you don't need to really cage those. But when you get into your taller tomatoes, which are your indeterminate types, they're vining tomatoes. So I have this cage right here that I'll use, and this cage is about 5 feet tall. So if the vining types get taller than this cage, I'll actually take about a 7-foot bamboo stake and I'll put it in the middle and I'll tie it up. You always want tomatoes growing up because a lot of your tomatoes fruit off of their new growth. So it's very, very important that they get their heads up into the sun so they produce. And another thing that a lot of people don't really touch on is how they produce. So determinate tomatoes reach a determinate height, which is 2 feet to 4 feet, and then they start flushing their fruit, which could be usually 1 to 4 flushes of fruit. So they'll give you tomatoes quicker and usually more of a concentration at one time. But when you get into indeterminate tomatoes, you'll get a little flower and little fruit. So they'll actually fruit over a longer period of time. So that's one thing to take in consideration when you're looking at the dwarfs and you're looking at the taller varieties, and not just the height, but on how they fruit. And one of the other things that I love is I'm going to talk a little bit about what tools I use. So I love tools. I'm sort of a tool guy. So I love the digging forks. The digging forks are really good because you can work in your fertilizer with them. You can actually level the ground with them, but I love these digging forks, the little stainless steel ones. And that's another thing with tools that I love is I love to grab the stainless steel ones because they don't rust. You always wipe off the dirt when you use them. So love the digging forks, the little hand rakes. You can rake up your leaves, you can work your fertilizer in. So especially if you're reaching, but I love the little hand rakes are so good. Again, stainless steel. Another one that I really like are just the little garden trowels. So really nice little garden trowel for digging. These would be more for digging out holes. And you can mix in the fertilizer too if you do turn it up this way and then scratch it in with the tip. And another subject to touch on is watering. So there's been so many things with watering, but with tomatoes, they want consistent watering, but they don't want to be really wet. So it really depends on where you live, container, ground. I always tell people, always water them really thoroughly. Give them a few days to dry out, water them thoroughly a few days. So in a container, especially if you're in a hotter area, if you're near the coast, you're going to be watering more frequently. You might be watering a few days a week. And so that's, something that, because the containers are going to dry out quicker. Now in the ground, even going into spring, I might water once a week, and if we get really hot, maybe twice a week. And as you get closer to ripening, you want to back the water off. You don't want to keep the plant so wet when the fruit's ripening. So when the fruit sizes up, you're getting your color, I like to really back off because I like my tomatoes, I don't like to be watery. So that's one thing, even about a week before they start fully ripening out, back the water way off and just make sure they have enough water but not over water. Okay, another topic that I like to touch on about tomatoes is calcium deficiency. And so calcium deficiency is a lack of calcium as the fruit's developing. And what happens is on the bottom of the tomato fruit, you'll get like a black lesion, and the black lesion gets bigger and bigger as the tomato grows. So one thing to really keep in mind, a lot of people always say the reason why you have calcium deficiencies is because you're watering inadequately. The plant's not taking up the calcium. But one thing to remember is if the soil doesn't have calcium, the fruit's not going to be able to take it up. The tomato plant's not going to take it up. So make sure when you're planting them in the ground or in pots, use a really good fertilizer like oyster shell meal, very high in calcium. Fish bone meal is really high in calcium. Regular bone meal, high in calcium. You always want to add a good amount right before you plant in the spring, like right now when you're getting ready to plant, because as it breaks down and in a couple months, the plants will have enough to take up. Once calcium is really in your soil, then you don't have to probably add as much, but sometimes I'll add about 5 to 10 pounds, so very important, and even very important for the sauce tomatoes. So any tomatoes that are longer, like the San Marzanos, the Romas, you want to make sure, and sometimes I'll put a handful of fish bone meal, oyster shell in their hole, and I'll mix it up. And with another subject with tomatoes is insect problems. And so one thing with insect problems, when you're dealing with whitefly and you're dealing with aphids and you're dealing with caterpillars. So whitefly is an insect that really goes after them. And the thing with whitefly that I always will do is when I'm planting, I always use a good amount of worm castings in the soil, because worm castings are really good and whitefly don't like them. With whitefly too, make sure that you put your tomatoes in full sun. If you put them in too much shade and they're really tender, the whitefly are going to go after them. So full sun, worm castings, and then you will use like an insecticidal soap or an organic soap if they be a problem. Aphids are another one that go after the new growth in spring, and I'll just use like an organic insecticidal soap. That works good for those. With caterpillars can get bad right when we go more into summer, like in June, July. So sometimes I'll take an organic spray like BT, and I might spray once a month. Another thing that I found that's worked very effectively in my garden at home is I'll put a little bird bath out for the birds, and they'll come and drink the water, but then what they'll do is they'll go through the plants looking for caterpillars. And I've never had a problem with caterpillars, but I do put water out for the birds. So sometimes using nature as your control, that does really help. This is David Rizzo from Rogers Gardens. Thank you for joining me today. And don't forget to come in and buy some of the Rizzo's tomatoes. And also follow us on social media and subscribe to our YouTube channel and watch our website for updates.